Thank you to the both of you. Thank you, Kathleen, for agreeing to come and have this conversation with us. Thank you, Nombuyiselo, who we're going to call Mbui as the preferred name. Thank you for joining us today, for availing your time. I know how busy both of you are. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time. We're going to get into it. And for everybody else who's listening into this webinar, thank you for the attendance. You can drop the questions in the chat, and we'll keep having a look at the chat so that we can pass them on to the speakers, to the panelists. I am Nyalleng Moorosi. I am a researcher with the Distributed AI Research. I live in Lesotho, and I'm going to be moderating this conversation. I'm fundamentally just a machine learning researcher interested in questions of machine learning or AI and society. And I think from my use and overuse of the word machine learning, it's very easy to realize that it's been a moment in the field and also where the roots are. But I guess now we're going to be talking about AI. And specifically, we're going to be talking about data, and we're going to be talking about how data is integrated into our work, not my work specifically, but the work of our two panelists, and what concerns they have, and what things they look forward to, what they find as the thing that works, and what are the things that don't work. So I'm going to let our two panelists introduce themselves. So first, we're going to have Mbui, if you can introduce yourself, where you are, who you are, what work you do, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nyalleng. Hello, everyone. Oh, load shading. I'm sorry. My name is Nombuyiselo Caroline Zondi. In short, I go by the name Mbui Zondi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pretoria, currently in the Faculty of Education. My PhD, or rather my interest, focuses on factors leading to poor reading outcomes in indigenous African languages, which is what I'm focusing on for my PhD. Then how do I come to the AI? I find AI very interesting, and this is where I went to knock on the door of Professor Bukosi Marivete to ask him to collaborate with me, as I am looking, or rather seeking, to find the vocabulary list that is appropriate or aligned to indigenous African language speakers, especially particularly learners in the foundation phase. So this is currently a project that we're trying to develop together, and I'm looking forward into moving forward with this project until my post-doc level. So yeah, so this is just a project, but I am happy to be part of this program today and also to see what I can learn from other speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mbui. Kathleen Siminyu, we have crossed paths a couple of times. Thank you for taking part here too. And if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Thank you, Nyalleng. My name is Kathleen Siminyu. I am based in Kilifi in Kenya. I'm currently doing a machine learning fellowship with Mozilla Foundation. In this role, I'm working on a project known as Common Voice. Common Voice is a dataset and a platform for speech recognition data. And I've particularly been focused on building for Kiswahili. So we're building right from the dataset. Well, the work has been ongoing for 2 years. We've gone from building the dataset, figuring out what characteristics are of importance for us to balance out right from the beginning, to training models and working with organizations within East Africa who have proof of concept implementation of the resources that we have created. I also wear several other hats. I've been organizing communities for a number of years, and I'm working with the Deep Learning Indaba, which is an organization working to strengthen African machine machine learning. I'm also working with the Masakhane Research Foundation, which is a network of researchers in Africa building for African languages. And then just before we got on this call, I discovered that Caroline and I are in the same lab, even though we have never met. So I'm also a master's student working with Vukosi at the University of Pretoria, and my research work there is also in the space of speech recognition, in this case looking at interpretability and trying to see if we can quantify the contribution of any one voice, or more generally group of voices, to an output speech recognition system. Thank you.
Oh, this is interesting. I also didn't realize that you had this overlap in the labs, because I have known of you from fairly different worlds. Mbui, I knew of your work even though I hadn't met you, because I know some of your colleagues. And we also forgot to mention that also as part of her very busy life, she lectures at the university. So once again, thank you both for coming here. I think the first thing is the question of data bias and the data inclusion, and how do we end representation. This is a question that we have been discussing for a very long time now, right? This is a very, very prominent question. This is a prominent concept in research, and I think especially for people who are not where I usually call like the center or the core or whatever. But I just wanted to talk to you, the both of you. I ask you a question of how does this concept manifest in your work? How do you think about the question of bias, of inclusion, of representation? How does this come up for you? Does it come up as a concern? Does it come up as the reason you do your work? Does it not come up at all because you actually work for the people you intended to? And like, how does this integrate in your work? You can, whomever can just go first.
Okay, I can start. So I mentioned that we've built the dataset for Kiswahili on Common Voice. We currently have about 1,000 hours, and we do collect some demographic features, right? So right from the outset, as this project was being scoped out, we looked at speech recognition literature and saw that gender bias is likely, with women being underrepresented in data sets, which results in lower performance in output systems. And the same is true with age bias, right? So older people are less likely to be represented, which leads to poorer performance in output systems. And then if we dig deeper, of course, these identities can be intersectional, right? So I may have 45% representation of women in the data set, which is actually close to what we have for Kiswahili. But then when we start to look at like women in their 40s, women in their 50s, women in their 60s, then we start to see that they really aren't represented, right? So going into the project, we were very aware that we wanted to mitigate age and gender bias, and the team developed a gender participatory guidelines document. I'm probably not remembering the actual term for this document, but it has guided our work to not only include women in collecting data, but to also figure out how we can give them the skills to use this data. Moving away from the data set, when it comes to the models, we've also been thinking very robustly about how to evaluate them. So in the context of speech recognition, there's the character error rate and the word error rate, which tell us how well our model is performing. But then again, being aware of the gender and age bias likelihood, we've curated test sets that are that are representative of these demographics, right? So there's a test set that is only women and one that is only men. And then we also go to the intersectional identities. Do we have enough women in their 50s to create a test set, and, you know, etc. Something else that is interesting is that very early on in our work, we invited linguists to share what they know about, you know, language. I find that sometimes technologists walk into the room and it's like, you know, we have the knowledge, so we're the experts in the room. But then it was great to acknowledge that, hey, linguistics and linguists have been studying Kiswahili for ages before we were interested in it in this capacity. And that work led to a lot of sociolinguistic learnings, which surprised me. I will say I did not expect to learn, for example, that there are native speakers of dialects that are related to Kiswahili who do not identify with the language that was standardized. And the language that was standardized is what is spoken all across East Africa and, you know, more widely in other parts of Africa and the world. The reason there's this distance is because of the process of standardization. It was entirely owned or largely owned by missionaries. And the taking of one dialect, realizing that it doesn't have enough vocabulary for the purposes that they wanted, and then adding words, led to a growing distance. Like by the time Kiswahili was standardized, the original dialect, which is known as Kiunguja, speakers of that dialect said, this is not Kiunguja, this is something else, right? And so we realized that we view our work as looking to include a population that is normally marginalized, but even Kiswahili as a language has marginalized dialects related to it. And in as much as we didn't have much room to change the direction of our project, we have been very intentional about creating enough subsets of data within our data sets that are representative of these other dialects. And the purpose is not to aim to train a fully, you know, fledged speech recognition model for these dialects, but really just to get to the point of evaluation again. Awareness is super important in my opinion. And so being able to tell whether our model has reduced performance on these dialects related to Kiswahili has been important to us. And then one last thing I can say before I hand over the mic is just last week we had a convening with a wider group of people that have been working with us on this Common Voice project. And it was interesting to compare Kiswahili to the other languages on the platform. So there's over 150 languages from all over the world available on the platform. And Kiswahili is one of very few that has balance. So we have about a third of the data being contributed by women, a third by men, and then a third of participants chose not to share their personal details. And this is something that we do by default. You can contribute to the data set without creating a profile, without giving us any personal data, if this is what makes you most comfortable. So it was interesting to note that for a language like Pashto, which is spoken, I think, in Pakistani, they actually have 97% contributions from men, and then the 3% that is not the men chose not to share their data. And in contrast, a language like Icelandic, and I learned that in Iceland, they're very aware of, you know, data privacy and really prefer not to share any data if they don't want to. So in Icelandic, 99% of contributors did not share their demographic details, but then they do have a sizable amount of data. So yeah, I hope this gives some perspective in terms of how we are thinking about data bias, but also just all the nuances we have to navigate when collecting the data and navigating people's concerns with sharing their information.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks, Kathleen. I'm like looking away because I've got my note sheet here with my pen and I'm taking notes because this is actually really wonderful discussions that you have brought up. And this is really what I hoped would be like the thing we do here. We are going to talk about the things that are on the ground, about our own personal concerns, because as they say, research is also personal. I pose the question to you. I know you sit in a very different space from Kathleen, but for you, how do these concerns pop up in education and language and representation and making sure that you're being inclusive and having enough of a coverage? And if you could please tell us specifically which area of education you're focusing on, primary, secondary, etc.
All right. Thank you so much, Nyalleng and Kathleen. So with regards to the education side of things, I don't know if you guys know about the PEARLS report, the progress in interrelated learning. So this is an international assessment study where the current findings were that 81% of South African learners cannot read for meaning in any language. So there are several factors that plays a role or impact negatively on the children's reading. One of them, it's like maybe poor teacher training, issues of policy not being consistent or lack of alignment amongst language education policies, the issues of structured pedagogy. And then, but when we focus on reading specifically, there are 5 components. There's phonics, there's phonemic awareness, there's vocabulary, there's comprehension, there's oral reading fluency. So for this discussion, I'll focus on the vocabulary. Currently, what we're doing with Professor Moderator is to try and collect a corpus, or what we call a vocabulary list. This list is important, and research studies are showing that if learners have enough vocabulary, they'll be able to read for meaning in any language. But then, unfortunately, Nyalleng, in South Africa, we have limited indigenous African language materials, especially in the foundation phase. Most materials are written in English and translated, or rather versioned, in indigenous African languages. This also creates some tension between educators, linguists, and various other people within the stream of literacy, such that the issues of dialects that Kathleen has spoken about. I mean, let's look in Pretoria currently. I'm in Pretoria. So there's a Tswana Pretoria and there's a Mafikeng or Setswana. So that there's different dialects. You know, the Tswana and Pretoria people refer it to Tsotsital. And then the one in Mafikeng or Botswana is referred to the standardized Setswana. So those are the issues, again, that causes this debate between us to say, which concept do we use when we write these materials? Okay, in Botswana, this is how we maybe refer, like for instance, let's look at the concept kilapile. So kilapile in Sesotho is when you say kilapile, it means you're tired. But then in Setswana, when you say kilapile, or in Sesotho, when you say kilapile, so you're hungry. But then in Setswana, when you say kilapile, it simply means you are tired. So you need to, when you write in these indigenous African languages, you need to take a context and content into consideration. Also, when we write, again, sometimes we don't know the terms in indigenous African languages, so we borrow from English. And when we borrow from English, sometimes the text loses its meaning. You know, we sing when we translate. I mean, currently I'm writing a book and I'm trying to translate in Sepedi from English to Sepedi, and the translation, the versioning, it loses that meaning of what I'm trying to say in the book. So also with the research currently, when it comes to vocabulary or corpus studies, they mainly focus on English first language or English as a second language. Nothing is to indigenous African languages. So that becomes a problem, because even with our current curriculum in South Africa, the CAPS, specifically in the foundation phase, we do have the frequency word list, but that list is drawn from the British children's storybooks and not the indigenous African languages, and it is translated. Again, it's not enough. It's about, I think, less than 200 words, if I'm not mistaken. And for a child to be able to read for me or comprehend, she or he needs around about at least 500 or 1,000 words to be able to read text with comprehension. So currently we don't have that vocabulary list. we have different projects focusing on these lists, but they're not publicly available. That's another challenge. They're not publicly available. And with regards to those, the question is, who is this list designed for? Is it the foundation phase learners, which is from grade 0 to 3? Is it the intermediate learners from grade 4 to 6? Is it the GET phase from grade 7 to 9 or FET from grade 10 to 11? We don't know that, right? And those lists that are being collected, the question again would be, what materials were used to design this corpus? Is it, the government gazettes, your magazines, newspapers? If it's children indigenous African language materials, which ones? Is it the readers? Is it the picture books? Is it the learner workbooks? What materials were used to collect this corpus, right? So we also don't know that. Again, there was something interesting that I find this year when I was listening to the IEA reporting with regards to Pearl's factors, is that they still find the same results as the one in 2016, that girls outperform boys. And I believe one of the challenges that the materials are most, when it comes to reading books or children's story books, they mostly focus on the girls' interest as opposed to boys. So personally, I was thinking to myself to say, maybe it's high time we ask all the learners, including boys and girls, what materials or what topics would you like us to write about? You know, I think maybe then we can improve the gender reading outcomes. And then another thing is with regards to the shortage of materials. What materials are required at the foundation phase level? Is it the readers? Is it the children's storybooks? Is it the learner workbooks? What materials can we have that can assist our learners in order to improve the reading outcomes? So I hope with the project that I'm doing with Professor Bokosi Marivete that we can contribute to this gap and continuously work on this project until we find the right answers, because currently we honestly don't know what causes learners not to be able to read in their indigenous African languages. And I think one of the solutions right now is to do interdisciplinary collaboration, which is currently what I'm doing with Professor Bokosi Marivete. And I hope that one day we'll also knock on the doors of neuropsychologists or neurologists to say, what's happening in a child's brain? How does a child learn? So that we understand reading in indigenous African languages and reading in English. So this does not mean we eradicate anything, Nyalleng, but this simply means we're bringing both perspectives together, the Western perspective and the African perspective. In combining these together, we'll call it a universal knowledge. This is one of the themes that I draw from the works of Paul Hotonji, one of the African philosophers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mbui. So much to learn. I actually have a question right back to you, Mbui. It seems like a really thorny area that you live in, and I'm thinking, as a machine learning researcher, right? Suppose somebody wants to build some of these tools, right, to help the students learn, or whatever it might be, right? You want to build some language tools in this area. How practical would that endeavor be, given what you know about the structures of the language and the data that is currently available? Two, what do you think is the best way to go about this? Like, what would be the best way to build this? Would a universal? Could we build something that is universal that all kids can plug in, or should we specialize and say, you know, we're going to build one for this language in this one location? Like, what's the thing to do here, given the nuance that you know, when you're thinking about it from AI as being a tool that comes in here, or even just from the perspective of building data sets?
I think it's collaboration, because Nyalleng, Sesotho, for instance, it's also spoken in Namibia and Zambia and Lesotho. So maybe we can share the materials from different countries. Let's say, for instance, we'll take magazines and say these magazines are strictly written in Sesotho. And then we call in the AI specialists to say, assist us in collecting, or rather doing this corpora, where we collect the corpus, and then we compare. Of course, there will be issues of dialect. Then we sit down and we say, look, this is the spoken dialect, this is the written dialect. So we need to also have an agreement about that. I think that's what's causing also some debates in the field. We need to say, this is the written language, this is the spoken language. Of course, we are aware that different dialects, maybe when we speak, we can say this is how we speak. But when we write, we need to have an agreement to say, this is how we write, and this is how we all write in Sesotho, in Southern Sesotho. So we need to collaborate, because I believe maybe in Lesotho, they might have maybe good children's storybooks. They can share with us. Maybe we might have magazines we can share with them. So we need to collaborate. We need to share materials all over.
Okay, thank you. To you, Kathleen, I have a different question. I believe this is an opinion. I think there is a tension between inclusion and autonomy and self-determination. By that, I mean, when the big tools are being built, we can decide to also collect data and include our data, right? To make sure we too are seen and represented in whatever the systems are, right? But there's this tension also that, as you said, the language was taken into the big machine that generated the current Kiswahili. But then the owners of the language lost the right to determine how their language is to be spoken and written and how it should grow and evolve, right? It became other people's language. What do we do here? Is there a happy middle? What do we do here? Is it, what do you think about this issue? How do you navigate this issue, given that you also build?
That's a very interesting and complex question. I definitely think about it maybe a lot in the context of data governance. So I'll share, for example, that it's been useful to have a standard Kiswahili that we all learn in school across East Africa, because it's a starting point. But, like Mbui says, when it comes to the spoken language, there's a lot of nuance, right? So here, the Kiswahili spoken in Kenya versus that spoken in the DRC is quite different, but at least we can align or understand each other because there's some shared words in the language. So on the platform, we've had a bit of a back and forth, because the sentences we are creating are not anything like the way people in the DRC speak or express themselves. And because the process of creating this data starts with us having sentences and then people read them out, we have gotten a lot of feedback that, hey, this is not how we speak. This Kiswahili is hard, right? But also the platform as is not built for us to have a Kiswahili for the DRC and a Kiswahili for, Kenya, or a Kiswahili along the East African coast. So it's, I guess, begs to question, is this inclusion and is it inclusive enough? Because in practice, it doesn't seem like it's inclusive enough, right? But we do get to tick the box and say that I think Kiswahili is one of the best resourced, low resource languages. And that's something. There's a lot of research available, and that's something. But at the end of the day, because we want to build tools that people can use, then they need to be able to accommodate the diversity and the nuance that we have in day-to-day interactions, and that's the thing to reconcile. Then there's a question of autonomy and self-determination, and maybe we can discuss a bit about how data licensing is happening on Common Voice, for example, right? Because all the communities that are building on the platform are leveraging the engineering capacity that is already built. The licensing that is set out for everything is that it is CC0, which means that everybody can anybody and everybody can have access to it, download it, and go use it. And on this platform in particular, we don't have a mechanism to track what they use it for. Right? You can download it, use it, we'll never know, and you never have to report back to us. But then in interacting with the communities that are building on Common Voice, we're starting to see a need for maybe thinking differently. So I'm not going to speak for Common Voice in this capacity. I don't know if, I'm not going to speak for Common Voice in this setting or in this instance, but we are seeing communities ask for a lot more autonomy. For example, researchers building datasets for speech recognition are hesitant to build on this platform because they don't get to control the publishing cycle. Something that's important to a researcher is the ability to be able to build the data set to a size that they want, and then to be able to write a paper to accompany this publication. And every time this data set is used, they get a citation. But as an example, this platform takes that away from them, takes that autonomy away from them. When thinking about I would say self-determination, I don't think it's always the case that the communities we are including by building these data sets are the ones that are best placed to make use of these data sets. We speak about inclusion from the standpoint of wanting to be able to build tools that these communities can use, but I don't often see the closing of the loop in terms of going back to the communities to ask them what use cases they want, right? We build machine translation data sets and then we make available this functionality, but maybe guys don't want a Google Translate. Maybe they want something else. But you see, we take their language, we want to include them, but then we don't give them the power of controlling what the data set is used for. And maybe this can fall under self-determination. And then if you give me a moment, I'd like to react to something that Mbui said. She mentioned that a lot of times when creating terminology, we'll take something from English and adapt it to the local language, right? This is something we use a lot. I wanted to highlight an instance of a project that is running at Masakhane. It's called Decolonize Science. And in this case, they're taking research work from African institutions that is written in English and translating it to, I think, 5 or 6 African languages. I learned that South Africa actually has a process for the creation of new terminology. And because this is scientific content, a lot of the words don't exist. Like, what is neural networks in, Kiswahili? It's a new concept. We have to create a new word. So South Africa actually has a methodology for creating new terminology, but then there's language boards that at the end of the day have to approve the addition or non-addition of a word into, the vocabulary. And I think in this case, the language boards have acted as gatekeepers more than anything. They've been very picky about whether the methodology has been followed to the word. And then something else that I wonder about is how to disseminate the use of new terminology, because it's one thing to create it and publish it, but then it's a completely other thing to actually put it in day-to-day usage or usage in whatever context you want it to be used in. And I think that's the bigger question, because low-hanging fruit is just to take the English word and, localize it. But I think there's value in having a methodology and creating this new terminology.
All right. We actually have a question from an attendee here. So it's 3 parts. I don't know if we're going to get to all 3 parts of them, but I also had a related question to this. So I'm going to ask you both of these two at the same time, and you can pick or you can do both. One is, you work in what we would call like a complementary area to like traditional. I know AI people are gonna like, everybody's gonna come at me with this terminology of like traditional, classic, whatever. But anyway, and one of the things that I wanted to know as I'm talking to you is, what are some of the calls, like funding calls, that either one of you would like to see that are related to data, but we don't usually see? So we have seen calls about curating data sets, right? We've seen calls about de-biasing data, which actually feel free to jump into that and tell me if you know of good methodology to de-bias data, or if you think we should be talking about de-biasing data, whatever. But what I wanted to know is, do you think there is an area of data creation that we don't usually get a call for because maybe we don't fully understand the pipeline and what is necessary, the resources that are truly necessary to create representative data sets, like inclusive data sets? So that's one. So the question in the Q&A, the part I wanted to include with this one was about now looking at the policymakers. What is the language for the policymakers? What should they be thinking? what are the things that they are not talking about that you think should be talked about? So one is about the funders, and the second one is about the policymakers. But they are both about basically what are the things that we're not seeing that are really important in this area of making sure we have good functional data sets.
Will I go first?
Yeah, go for it.
With regards to funding, okay, this just caught me now. I've never thought deeply about it, but of course there are projects that's been done when it comes to materials. Maybe one of them would be do a project with regards to providing access to maybe universities, teachers, professionals with copyrights and usage permission and data protection measures, maybe also invite community members to assist us in collecting the corpus, the spoken one especially, so that we improve the languages in universities and enhance the cultural preservations and raising awareness into these language. Maybe also have funding for workshops where we educate parents, especially community members, about the importance of teaching indigenous African languages, especially at the foundation phase. I think we need to engage the community. We need to involve the parents. We need to involve everyone. It's not about just researchers. And also maybe continuously make a project such whereby we invite people who are not researchers to write these materials, seek funding for them to assist us to write the materials. Because I believe old people, they've got a lot of vocabulary. Because of some of the words, if I don't know, I ask my grandmother. I call other people in our community to say, look, I need assistance. I don't know this concept. And they know a lot. But unfortunately, when it comes to our indigenous African languages, most of the text or material is not anecdoted. So that becomes challenging. So maybe let's find funding and seek funding, apply for funding, and then we invite people to come on board to work with us and collaborate and make it a teamwork. I've learned that this year that at the bottom, people are competing, but at the top level, people are collaborating. And my understanding is collaboration should involve everyone, from community members to parents, learners, teachers, government stakeholders, university management, everybody must be involved. With regards to policy makers, when it comes to education, I think also the policy maker should invite everyone in the disciplines of education, teachers, definitely, material developers, publishers, professionals at the university, members of the community, to say, how can we make this policy effective, or language education policies effective in classrooms? Material developers, how does your material align with the policy? That's very important, Nyalleng. The materials must align with the policy, right? The teaching as well, the teaching strategies must align with the policy. The teaching training must align with the policy. Because at the moment, when I read the CAPS in South Africa, the question that comes to my mind when it comes to reading is, what constitutes reading? I don't know. So we draw our knowledge and understanding of reading from the Western perspective. When it comes to African perspective, what is reading? For instance, what's the difference between teaching phonics in indigenous African languages, like isiZulu, for instance, different from teaching phonics in English? I don't know. So we also take the Western reading methodology or teaching methodologies and apply it in classrooms where we teach indigenous African languages. That becomes another challenge. So yeah.
All right, thank you. I love that. I especially really like that point about making like the calls for the non-traditional researchers, right? Like your grandma. These are very, very rich knowledge bases for this, but I don't think we ever really explore that. How do we put them on that budget sheet, like, right? Like, how do we have to say we're consulting with experts, right? But it is also they are experts, but they are very much not. I know I'm going to get very, with this use of traditional. Anyway, Kathleen, please go for it. We've got about 10 minutes.
So to address the funding question, I'm always thinking that we can frame calls in ways that make the data sets we create of value to people other than the machine learning people, right? So we have a call, we say it's NLP data, and then we start creating data sets that are out of the box for, machine translation or speech recognition. But I think that to actually get data sets that are contextually and culturally relevant, we could think more critically about maybe engaging writers in these contexts and asking them to write about their everyday experiences. It would be cool to document shared experiences in different contexts across Africa, especially, just because, we have oral traditions. A lot is spoken about and not documented in terms of text, which is much longer living, right? So when I say shared experiences, I think about, for example, election periods in Kenya, or, years where we've had post-election violence. Every time an election year comes, we're all tense and we all know why, but I don't think it's documented why. Or another shared experience we have globally is the pandemic. Like, what happens if you just ask people to speak about where they were when the first COVID case was reported in their country, and to speak it in their own languages, or to write it in their own languages? Or now thinking about, and then displaying this in a manner for people to explore, right? It's not just in a like .csv where I will come and ingest it into my model, but it's maybe on a website and somebody can say, hey, I wrote that, and own it. Or in a historical setting. I've been visiting museums lately in different towns in Kenya where I go, and I think it's so sad that we only document in English. I assume because the expectation is that it's the tourists that are going to visit the museums. And then I visited the Genocide Memorial in Kigali, and I was so impressed that they have it documented in text in Kinyarwanda, in French, and in there's a third language, I think, yes, and in English, but then Kinyarwanda is like bigger fonts. And I think this signaling is super powerful. So I wish we were doing more to capture historical context in our languages, and that being a primary purpose. And, you know, this is content that I can then take and process into a format that I will use in my work. And then when it comes to policymakers, I think about the fact that we in Africa, we have universities that have existed for 30, 40, maybe 50 years. We have generations of skilled professionals in education, in medicine, in engineering, and people are unemployed. People are looking for ways to earn a living, and AI is now here. And I think that everybody trying to pot to fit into the world of AI is a bit of a waste. I'd love to see much more multidisciplinarity encouraged. What happens when we put ML people in a room with doctors and have them talk about the experiences they've had with treating, you know, rural populations and capturing that as data, but then also having the doctors define what tools would be of use to them, right? I think about doctors a lot because now my parents are a little over 60, both retired, both still very knowledgeable with a wealth of experience. But it's like, okay, typically what happens in this setting when you retire is that you move into farming and, you know, building your village home. But I think there's still a lot of value that people like these can give to us, and ownership. So the last point for me is ownership, because as we generate all this data, I wish that there was policies that defined how the people that are instrumental to generating this data can have value brought back to them. The benefit sharing aspect would be super important.
All right. Okay. Thanks to the both of you for those points. I think we're going to have time for just one more question. And I think like one more question each of you or will share. But the last question that actually it's here in the Q&A, but I think I asked a version of this question. But maybe we should just dig into it a little bit, because I do think it is a question that is important when we're thinking about data collection. Traditionally, data collection requires huge consent forms. And in statistics, consent means that the person fully understands the scope of the problem, right? Like of the ask. They understand where their data is going to be stored, how their data is going to be used, when their data is going to be deleted, who has access to their data, all of this sort of stuff. In machine learning, not so much. We don't, except in highly regulated spaces, for example, health, and hopefully in education, hopefully. But I know there are some places where it's not really true in education, where we wiggle around. But every time we collect data, there is this question about datafication of a community. And by that, I mean where a community is over-documented, whatever you will call over-documented, right? Over-documented is related to exposure to risk, right? The fact that, like, for example, as at the point of where one is, right? Like I always tell my family, I'm like, everything has to be in line, right? Like I need to make sure all my visas and all my passports and all my this and all my that, because I am over documented, right? It's so easy to track me given all the countries I've lived in, right? All the countries that have my biometrics, all of this, right? There is no way, right? If I decided to get into the life of crime, it would be very unsuccessful. But without people wanting to get into lives of crime, there is a danger to documenting populations. And here we are documenting populations without them really knowing. Like you've been saying, Kathleen, the people who create data don't always know where and who's going to have access to it and how it's going to be used. How do we wrestle with this? When we want to be inclusive and include people who are otherwise marginalized and include people who are not sitting here and building these AI products, how do we wrestle with this question of inclusion and de-biasing our data sets while making sure we do not over-document people and we do not datafy their entire lives?
I can try to take a stab at this. I think that part of the answer needs to be educating everyone about the opportunities, but also leaving them with enough control of their data that you always have to come and let them know that something new has been discovered. Your data would be a good candidate for use in this case. Would you be open to it, right? To the first point, there's a very popular course called AI for Everyone. But I don't think everybody needs to become an AI researcher, for example. But I do think everybody needs to understand how they are already participating in this AI economy through the availability of their data. And then with that knowledge needs to come control, right? And that's the control that needs to be fashioned into we as machine learning people going back to the people. And it doesn't need to be every individual. We could have proxies for communities, people who have a deeper knowledge of the data and, you know, are the person who needs to make the decision for these particular communities. But I think there always needs to be that loop back to the communities of informing them or educating them about what new uses there are, and then letting them know that their data can do that and asking them if this is something they want. But then also having them decide, given the new uses or technologies available, what they would like to be built for themselves.
Yes, please.
I think on our side, I would say we need to ask for information, like Kathleen says, inform the community members. What is research? I mean, remember, most of them, especially the adults, will not know what research is. What is research? What's the importance of this research? Why are we doing it? What does it mean? You know, I think it's important that we don't just go to the field and collect data. I mean, at the end of the day, we might impede people's human rights, but we also need to ensure secure data encryption and storage. You know, we need to control user access and permission, look at the regular data audits and update. I think that's important. Inform legal agreements. Yeah, I think that's what we need to look into.
Okay, we are actually at the hour. And first of all, I've got to thank the both of you. Thank you so much for such an engaging, very different conversation too. And I am grateful for that because I think it's very complementary to the other conversations we've been having. I am grateful that you're both willing to share the practicalities of your everyday concerns. And I thank AI4D for giving us this platform to discuss all of these. Our audience, thank you for the participation. Thank you for the great questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. There's actually a really cool one, which if either one of you want to ruminate over, this is about inclusion on smaller African languages. And we know how many different languages there are. And every time you're thinking of building a product, we're thinking about the big languages, right? For example, we're given an example of Wolof in Wolof in Senegal. There is a multitude of other languages that we don't see there, right? But anyway, this is a problem that we know because Africa is incredibly diverse, which is why I think it's also so difficult to document, right? Because diversity does not lend itself very well to prediction. And prediction is the name of machine learning and it's the name of AI. So this is a very fun and interesting place, I think, to be deploying these tools. And I think we probably have posed more questions than answers to this, but I think this is wonderful because this is such a big topic about data. Data in AI creates ground truth. Ground truth seems to be now going to create real truth, right? Now we've got systems that are predicting things, and these things get included into the corpus of what we are learning. So I think this is all very important for us to be involved and aware. So with that, I want to thank the both of you. Thank you for this hour. Thank you to the organizers, Women in the Table, to Caitlin and the team there, and for AI4D, and to everybody, goodbye.